Okay, let's begin. The Gemara that we learned yesterday was number one about the Noye Sukkah, the beautifications of the Sukkah. And with regard to the height, they're not Mamayet the Sukkah. They don't take away from the height of the Sukkah. However, they do take away from the side of the Sukkah. And and so that was the opinion of Ravashi mentioned that Amar Ravashi Menatzad Mematin. Then we had the statement of the story of Minyamin, the story of Minyamin, the servant, how he was the servant of Ravashi, and he put his garment to dry on top of the sukkah, and basically there wasn't a problem with that. It was the only issue was that people are going to think that you can be masachich, use a garment for schach. So once it dries, he needed to remove it. That was what the conclusion of the Gemara was, that you got to remove it, otherwise people will get the wrong impression. And while it's wet, it's not a problem, but afterwards, otherwise, while it's dry, that's when it's a problem. It's wet, it's not a problem. So
Okay.
there is a question that the commentaries ask over here regarding putting this garment on top. I mean, we've been dealing with this issue of the fact is, I mean, it is schach puzzle. So how do you get around the schach puzzle issue? So according to the way we saw in Tosfos, it wasn't such a problem because you have kosher schach. Without it, so that's not a problem. When you need to use it for schach, that's when it becomes a problem. That was the way Tosfos was learning. But the problem was the way Rashi learns, that even if you have a kosher sukkah, but then you have schach puzzle. So in fact, that was the meaning of the Mishnah. Firis Allah Sadim. You put a sheet over it. For shade. Even though you have kosher schach, but now you've ruined it with your sadin. So the way Rashi was learning, seemingly it should be a problem here as well, that you're being masachech for a davar hamakabel tuma. With davar hamakabel tuma, something that's a garment, that's a beged, that's a kli, that's makabel tuma. It's not kosher for schach. So one of the commentaries says that since you're putting it there not for the schach purposes, it does not ruin the kashrus of the sukkah. Meaning you're putting it there only for itself, for it to dry. If you were putting it there for the as schach, so then it could be problematic, or it would be problematic. You're putting it there to give shade. You're putting it there, so that's a problem because the shade that you're getting is from a place, something that's makabel tuma, that's puzzle. But you're putting it there for no purpose of schach. In other words, it's not even there to do anything to protect you. It's there simply because you're just hanging it there. So that's one interpretation of why it wouldn't be a problem. Another answer that's given is that there was no person in the sukkah at that time. And so, it was just it was there just to dry when people were not using the sukkah for food or for drink, for sleeping, and for any other purpose. If there would have been a person there, maybe it would have actually been puzzled to sit there and do anything there. And so the fact that people might get the wrong impression, that would be a problem. Because if you put that there as schach, it still could be a problem of like maris ayin type of thing, where people are going to think that you're allowed to use it for schach, and therefore you shouldn't be drying your garment there, because that'll give the wrong impression. But if there would be people there, would have another problem, that you're in a sukkah that's puzzle, that you're really you're really not allowed to eat there or sleep there. Now, the understanding would be that when it's wet, people understand no one's in there. But once it's dry, people are going to think, oh, you're probably going to be eating there, and that gives a much bigger maris ayin. Knows when it's wet, they know, oh, you're drying it there, you're waiting till it dries, But once it dries, then people are going to get the impression that you're actually using it, and you're going to have it there while you're eating and sleeping. Anyway, so that's another interpretation. That's a way of explaining this. Yes, Jeffrey.
It's exactly parallel to the idea of having a sheet underneath the top. If you have it for the right purpose, then, I'm sorry. I thought you could hear me.
We do.
Okay. So if you have it for the right purpose, then the sheet is a beautification, and you have it hanging around the sukkah. But if you have it to catch the leaves, it's going to take up a big area, and it's really not the correct usage of that kli. Similarly over here, if it's just, the way I see it, something that's wet, you want to hang down. It's just hung on the edge, and it's hanging down and dripping down. And that's why he says, if someone will look at, they'll see that it's wet and it's dripping, and that's the only reason it's up there. It's only covering a very small area. So even if you have puzzle, if it's only like one tefach, it wouldn't be affecting the whole sukkah. So something is wet, even if it's a big garment. I'm seeing it's like an egg, and it's hanging down off the kind of poles that I have, or whatever, and it's dripping, and everybody could see that it's dripping, and it's just for just a few minutes or whatever it takes. Of course.
So your answer to the question, you want to give an alternative answer, basically, that here we're talking about that it's small. It's a beged, it's a garment that's small, and therefore, it's not going to passel the sukkah, but it would make a problem maybe of maris ayin, but it's not going to passel the sukkah because it's small. That's what it sounds like from what you're saying. Right? Is that more or less what your answer? In other words, Piris Allah Hasadin, the Mishnah, that case, it's a very big area that you're covering. You're covering the whole sukkah. You're covering the whole bottom of the entire sukkah is being covered. Here, you're putting on a garment, a shirt, maybe it was a thin slave, and it was a small shirt, and maybe sleeveless, so it's how big of a shirt is it? It's he's so it's a small thing, so it's not a problem to sit in the sukkah. And according to halacha, you're right, you have up to like 4 tefachim. You have up to 4 tefachim of to sit in schach puzzle. The only thing that, to me, that it does sound surprising, because according to halacha, you are allowed to have a small, you are allowed to have schach puzzle. Now, if what you're saying is correct, that something small is not a problem to sit under, but it could be a problem maris ayin. So how could it say in Shulchan Aruch that that you're allowed to have schach puzzle amidst your schach kosher? What about the maris ayin problem? It must be that when you have a small amount, it's not a problem of maris ayin either. And therefore, the whole concept over here, which I'm using the term maris ayin loosely, it's the Gemara doesn't actually use that term, but the concept, it seems like it's a similar concept here that is like a maris ayin type of problem. So it seems that the only issue that you'll have with the maris ayin is only when it's a very large, it must be a very large garment, because if it was small, as you want to say, I don't think the maris ayin would be an issue, whether it's wet or dry, even if it's dry, because it's such a small thing. It doesn't passel the sukkah. So anyone who sees it is not going to say, oh, you're allowed to use this for the entire sukkah. They're going to say, oh, I'm allowed to use a sukkah with a small amount. That's considered, that's schach puzzle. So therefore, I don't know if you could, you know what I mean? You have to tweak your answer a little. I don't think that would, I don't know if that would work. But anyway, it's good try. Definitely a good thought. So the Gemara basically tells us that this story of Minyamin having this garment on top of the sukkah, there is an issue of Marisayan type of thing where people will see it and people will say that and and that only applies when it's dry. It won't apply when it's wet. And we basically have these two answers to answer up Rashi. We said Tosfos, it wouldn't be such a problem because in Tosfos we're basically saying that there is no such problem of having schach puzzle as long as you have sufficient schach kosher. And the truth is, we also saw another opinion in that David kept mentioning that if you start your sukkah with schach kosher and you have a kosher amount of it, and then afterwards you add some schach puzzle, that's where that case is definitely is not a problem. So here also you wouldn't have that problem according to these two ways of understanding it. And then you have these other two answers that we have in Rashi, and one is a very dacustic, very delicate and thin difference. You have the very slight difference between how to differentiate between this case and the case of the Mishnah, where in the case of Noi, how do you compare this more to this garment? You're going to compare to more to the Noi of the sukkah, to the beautifications of the sukkah, rather than to the putting a sheet over your sukkah because of shade. That basically you have to say that it's the way he's explaining it. The way the Meiri is explaining it is that it has to do with the fact that you're not putting it there for schach purposes. It's not in order to benefit your sukkah, and therefore it doesn't fall into the category of schach puzzle. It's a little you have to think about how to really differentiate it. But ultimately, there's an alternative answer, and that is that there's no one in the sukkah. And it actually would puzzle the sukkah, but we're dealing with the sukkah that no one's in, and that's why it's not a problem. And the only problem is the lemru, that people shouldn't say about that this is okay. All right. So anyway, those are the commentaries on this little piece of Gemara, and then we had a statement from the Amoraim Itmar that the Noi sukkah, if it's 4 tfachim away from the sukkah, away from the schach, if it's lowered four hand breaths far from the schach, so that is machlokes Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda, Rav Bar Rav Huna. Rav Nachman has this opinion that it's not a problem, it's batel to the schach, it becomes nullified to the schach. In Rav Chizda, Rav Bar Rav Huna say that it is puzzle. It is a sheer makom choshev. It's a measurement that's significant. 4 tfachim away, that's a significant, sizable area that it's away from the schach. So it's not called a noi for the it's not considered a batel to the schach, not considered nullified to the schach. It's like a tent on its own, and basically a person who would sleep under it would not be sleeping in a sukkah. They'd be sleeping under this noi, these decorations.
We're going to take up a topic like that later on too, about sleeping under something.
Right. So, yes, we are. That's correct. It's actually coming up very soon. So we mentioned yesterday the opinion of the Ramah that even though the measurements of these decorations, in order to really passel your sukkah, they have to have a width of 4 tefachim, and otherwise they would not passel your sukkah. But we said that the Ramah, Mishnah explains it, that we should be careful even if it's small decorations, if they are 4 handbreadths away from the schach. Mishnah explains it because we're afraid maybe you'll have many of them, and it will add up together to be 4 handbreadths of width, and that would be problematic. Now, I will mention that there is a discussion in the commentaries about this concept of the 4 tefachim rule, and one of the ways that a number of commentaries mentions that this discussion here is not just that you're now inside an oihel, in a tent, but really this falls in the category of a sukkah tachas hasukkah. You're in a type of noi, an area of decoration that's covering you, and that is it's considered to be like a separate sukkah, and the top sukkah is basically a sukkah that has a measurement of 4 handbreadths. Now, if you remember earlier on, we had an argument if the size of a sukkah that's on top that will prohibit you from being in a sukkah is the fact that you're in an enclosure that's below another enclosure, and the other enclosure, how much area does it need? Does it need 10 handbreadths, which was Shmuel's din? Or there were other opinions, either 4 handbreadths or 1 handbreadth. So this argument here of Nachman, Rav Chizda, Rabba bar Rav Huna, so again, if we look back, we have Rav Huna that said a tefach. Then we had Rav Chizda and Rabba bar Rav Huna that said 4 handbreadths. And then we had Shmuel. So it's the same Rav Chizda and Rabba bar Rav Huna that mentioned earlier. Again, we're on page 10b, but on 10a, we had this discussion and we had those same names, Rav Chizda and Rabba bar Rav Huna. So according to some commentaries, they're learning that this issue that you're in a structure that's under another structure, and we're going to call it 2 separate structures because the top structure has a significant measurement to it, and that is, according to Rabba bar Rav Huna, Rav Chizda and Rabba bar Rav Huna, according to them, that measurement of the top sukkah is 4 handbreadths. So if you have your decorations that are hanging below either 4 handbreadths or more below the tops, the top schach, that would mean that that you're inside a structure that's not really in a sukkah because you're under a different sukkah. It's considered a separate sukkah because he holds that the 4 handbreadth measurement is the size, that's the cutoff line. Now, the other opinion, Rav Nachman would hold that there is a 10 handbreadth cutoff line. And according to this way of understanding it, the Gemara doesn't tell us this, but Rav Nachman also has a cutoff point. It's 10 handbreadths. Now, if you learn the first way that we were learning, like the simple way of Rashi, that this is not a problem of a sukkah inside a sukkah, this is a problem of having something separating you from the schach. So this is not really connected to that previous Gemara. It might be, I shouldn't say it's not connected at all because it might have a similar idea, the idea of 4 handbreadths being significant. So it has a similar idea, but the actual law doesn't fall into the same category. And if you learn it that way, then what comes out, it seems that Rav Nachman, according to Rav Nachman, is there a cutoff point? Is there an area where this is too low, this schach? This schach is too low, and it's not considered batel to the schach. So let's say you have a very tall sukkah. You have a very high ceiling, which people enjoy, nice high ceilings. You have a nice high ceiling, especially when you want to shake your lulav and ester your lulav, and it's a tall lulav. You don't want it banging on the roof. So if you make a nice high sukkah, which is definitely more enjoyable. Now you want to hang the fruits. Now if you hang the fruits very high up, your decorations high up, whatever, if you hang it very high up, you don't see it as much. So what about hanging them very low? So according to the first way we learned, it didn't seem like Rav Nachman has a cutoff point. Like you can lower that, you can have them lowered, quite. It can hang down 20, to 20 cubits, 30 cubits. I don't know cubits. It can hang down handbreadths, 20 handbreadths, 30 handbreadths, no problem. But according to this new way of learning the Gemara, there's a cutoff point. Rav Nachman holds that shita that's 10. That there's the cutoff point would be 10. Okay. Anyway, so we had this story where Rav Chizda and Rabba bar Rav Huna went to this Reish Galusa, the exilarch, on Sukkot, and the understanding was that they're going to be makabel panim. They want to honor him by fulfill a mitzvah of seeing this great person, and he not all the exilarchs were special people, but this one obviously was considered he was a Talmud Chacham and so on, and they wanted to fulfill the mitzvah of Hakbalas Pnei Rabbi Beregel. To be Makabel Pnei Rabbi, there's a mitzvah to go to your Rebbe on the holiday. It is interesting that this mitzvah of Hakbalas Pnei Rabbi Beregel is not brought down in Shulchan Aruch. In other words, it's brought in the Gemara about going to your Rebbe on Yantiv and be makabel panim, but it's not brought in Shulchan Aruch or Rambam. It seems to have been left out. So there's discussion about it. If maybe the mitzvah of Hakbalas Pnei Rabbi only applies in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. And it had to do with the fact that if there would be a mitzvah to go Hakbalas Pnei Rabbi in today's day, you would end up being honoring your Rebbe more than you're honoring Hashem, because we're not Oila Regel in today's day. We don't go to the Beis Hamikdash. And if you would have a mitzvah to go and be makabel panim your Rebbe, then you're honoring your Rebbe more than Hashem. So there's a thought that maybe that's the reason why it might not be brought in halacha, this Hakbalas Pnei Rabbi Beregel, because of this issue. Although our Gemara doesn't seem that way, because our Gemara is talking about Amoraim. They lived after the time of the Beis Hamikdash, Reish Galusa. They're going to the exilarch, he's the head of the Galus, and it's after the time of the Beis Hamikdash and Amoraim, and yet they're considering it a mitzvah to be makabel panim. At least according to some opinions, that's the mitzvah here. Other opinions say it was a different mitzvah. They're fulfilling a different mitzvah, opinion shvuyim, and so on. But anyway, there is such a concept of maybe a reason why the mitzvah of Hakbalas Pnei Rabbi might not be brought.
Rabbi?
Yes, Moshe.
In New York, in Brooklyn, there was I don't want to mention the rabbis, it was a very big Rav, had a very big sukkah, and it was almost like a museum when you walked in there. There were pictures of all the big rebbeim, and then they served the meal in there. It was like for the the Talmudim, and I was fortunate to be able to participate. But it was an honor. I mean, it was at the home of a very big Rav, in Brooklyn, and Midwood. I think it was Midwood, if I'm not mistaken. And I mean, so are we saying that was not really appropriate? I mean,
what's not appropriate?
that it would be like honoring the Rav instead of Hashem.
No. It's talking about going to your Rebbe as a this is your main Rebbe and showing more honor to him. And it doesn't mean you're walking down the street to go and learn some Torah at your Rebbe's house.
No. I'm saying that wasn't that. It was he was the Rebbe of actually my son. Okay, my son was one of his Talmidim, but I'm just trying to tell you that it was. But these were all the it wasn't just learning Torah. This was going into a sukkah, and having a meal but it was more than that. It was just like it was almost like a museum going in there. But it seemed like what you're saying. It may even have the essence of both. You know what I'm saying? Of giving honor to Hashem.
No. First of all, there's nothing wrong with going. The question is if there would be a mitzvah. That's all. If it would be a mitzvah that would be a chiyuv midrabanan. In other words, would they make such a? Would there be such a mitzvah? It's not. It's definitely not an issue, and it would be. It's only a question of being a mitzvah. Of course, there's a mitzvah of kibbud rabbi is. You know what I mean? There's a mitzvah to learn Torah. Again, the other commentaries mention here not the mitzvah of hakbalas pnei rabbi, but more the mitzvah of go learn Torah, pidyon shvuyim, and they even mention that maybe they came to hear the drasha. So they came not stam to learn Torah, but to hear he used to give a drasha on Chol Hamoed. So they went to hear the drasha. So in other words, there's other reasons why he's going, not just hakbalas pnei rabbi. You want to hear the drasha. This is the yearly drasha. What?
You should have a good time.
Enjoy. Right. Maybe he has good wine. Or enjoy being together. Just enjoy being together. Right. But and also
let me think of it. Yes. There's a word for it. Flat brain, yeah.
Yes, Jeffrey.
I think it's political. In certain periods of time, the Etzalach was recognized as the head of the Jewish society inside the other country, and in certain periods, that was very important. That person had to represent the needs and the right to have our laws carried out. And so in certain periods of time, I don't think they specify too much, then it really would be very important to come and say, I'm from this part of your community, and we have the following going on, and we need some protection, or we need somebody to speak for us because we have to fix this road, or we have to be permitted to do such and such. So and I think that's why also when they're asked about sitting in a sukkah that's not according to their interpretation, they could say they're on a trip of a mitzvah because they have other motives for coming, and therefore they're not disputing the interpretations here. So he's not exactly the person that they would necessarily want to come to hear the drasha from, but rather that they just want to make sure that they know we're checking in, we're part of your community, we live in this area, that we have the following needs, and we have expansions or whatever.
So that's an interesting question, because what you're mentioning is really, it's a question of political connections, which ultimately you expect will lead to some type of mitzvahs. But can you call that a mitzvah in its own right? In other words, let's say someone's imprisoned right now, So you're going to use your political connections to try to help them get them out of this imprisonment or this hostage situation. So now you're involved in a mitzvah, there's no question. Pidyon shvuyim. You don't know if it'll work, but you're fulfilling a pidyon shvuyim. What about if no one's a hostage and no one's in prison, and you go and you're trying to develop a relationship with this political, powerful individual? Can you call that at this point you're Isaac in a mitzvah and you're called a shluchei mitzvah? You know, you're definitely doing something important. There's no question, but I'm not sure if that would be considered a mitzvah at this point. It deserves to be looked into. In other words, maybe that could be considered a mitzvah. Again, your goal is to ultimately, you know, it's of course l'shem shamayim. You're going for Hashem. You're going l'shem shamayim. But can you actually call that is that an actual mitzvah that you're, you know, because you're making a vessel, begashmius, to bring blessing to possibly, you know, would that be good enough to be considered a shluchei mitzvah? You know, it's not so simple. It's almost like I was gonna say it's almost like on Shabbos, you know, someone needs, you know, in the early days, you know, people would lose their job if they didn't work on Shabbos. So in that scenario, many people lost their jobs every Shabbos. They didn't work. They came back on Sunday to get paid. Sorry, you didn't come on Shabbos. You don't get paid. You don't have your job. So someone might take that and say, well, you know, I'm ultimately going to die, and therefore, if I don't have work, and therefore maybe, you know, you could sort of build on that and come up with some leniency, but you know, obviously that wasn't the appropriate heter. Maybe if it was a case of life and death immediately, that would be one story. But in the scenarios that we know, many people who lost their jobs, they had a lot of merit, and ultimately it impacted their children in a positive way, that their children stayed from, and so on. So you know, so I'm just saying, like, you know, you're sort of like taking this idea that, you know, we need to get political connections, which is true. It's important to have that, as long as you have the right kavana, that you know that you don't put all your trust. You don't put any trust in your political connections. It's only like a gashmistic vessel, and it is important to have some type of connections. But at the same time, I don't know if that's called a mitzvah until it actually is a mitzvah. He uses the plural, so it's more than one person, I believe. It's a committee that's coming from this town some distance away. They can't come all the time. Not if they have this ability, and they're checking in, and they're saying, "Look, we are coming from this group over here. Yeah, we're still doing what we have to do. Don't forget about us." And we came to let you know that this is the news from that part of your right. I don't. Maybe it is a shluchei mitzvah. I don't know. Maybe they are right. They're sent from the community, so you know, maybe they are. I'm just saying. I think we have to think about it more. I'm not paskening. I'm not saying that for sure it's a problem. I'm just saying I'd have to think about it more to think if that's considered a shliach mitzvah. You're a shluchim of the community. That's true. And there's an ultimate goal, you know, for mitzvah. But would that be called the shluchei mitzvah? It's an interesting question. Thank you for bringing it up. And it might have a good point. In fact, you know, I should say this, that the other commentaries bring down that this is pidyon shvuyim. Yeah. According to the way you're explaining it, you know, you might be able to say that it doesn't mean there's a pidyon shvuyim right now. It means a pidyon shvuyim that might come up. You know, if you want to learn it that way, then you sort of like could explain it that it's a pidyon shvuyim that's going to come up. Anyway, bottom line is we have these different interpretations here. And why are there different interpretations? Why are they not comfortable with the Kabbalas Pnei Rabbi interpretation of the Reish Galusa? So number one, it uses the word iklu. Iklu generally means that they happened to pop in. It sounds like they're not actually going for that purpose to the Bei Reish Galusa. It sounds, they were in the area, they're doing some other mitzvah. We're right near the Reish Galusa. Let's go. Let's pop in. So iklu, the Bei Reish Galusa, the word iklu sounds like they happened upon, and not that they went there. Or the other interpretation that I shared with you is this thought that it has to do with the fact that maybe there is no mitzvah to go kabbalas hakbalas pnei rabbi, and therefore they couldn't claim that they're shluchei mitzvah. Anyway, so those are the two ways of understanding it. And bottom line is that they went to the Bei Reish Galusa, and Rav Nachman, who was the in charge over there, he was like the head of the Bezdin, and he was involved. He was a mamuna. He was the appointed one in the house of the Bei Reish Galusa. So the term is used mitzava beveis reish hagoyla. He was the mitzava. Everything was according to his command, and so Rav Nachman, it seems like he took advantage of the situation, and he put them in a sukkah that had noya that were the decorations were more than 4 tfachim away from the schach, and they kept quiet. They didn't say anything. Now, the Rav Nachman then told them that, you guys are, it seems like in the morning after they went to sleep, because there's Agninu, he put them to sleep over there, and they didn't say anything. Amar lahu, and he said to them, so you guys are backed out of your shita, of your opinion, and they said, we are shluchei mitzvah, we do not even need to sleep in a sukkah, we are exempt. And that was the story, a little surprising, isn't it? Lifnei Iver, they hold that this is usher. How could Rav Nachman give them something that they hold is prohibited, is not allowed? And that was a question the Ritva asks. And we mentioned that since the Isser is nicker, since they see that it's more than that, it's 4 tfachim or more, so it's not called Lifnei Iver because they see it very clearly. So he's not putting a stumbling block before them. They have it right in front of their eyes. They see it. They could stop. They don't have to sleep there. They could say something. They could go somewhere else.
That's how you know it's not Lifnei Rabbo.
That's what?
That's how we know they didn't come to study with them.
Well, Rav Nachman wasn't the one who was their teacher, because then they probably would have followed his view. Right. But it seems that they were on similar, it seems like they were acquaintances rather than contemporaries, and rather than one was the teacher. And so anyway, so so he said, did you guys retract? And they said, no, we're shluchei mitzvah. So the thing is, one of the commentaries wanted to say that you see from here that if you hold something's permissible, you're allowed to give it to someone else. They don't hold that way. Too bad. You hold that it's permissible. You're not over Lifnei Iver. But the Ritva doesn't agree with that. He says it can't be. It's a problem. So there was such a thought that this is a proof that it's permissible, and the Ritva pushes that off and says that it can't be. It must be that because it's nicker, because it's recognizable, that's why he was allowed to do that. Rav Nachman was allowed to do that. Now, we also mentioned what happens if there's other sukkahs in the area. Are they shluchei mitzvah? They're exempt completely? Or is it only because maybe it would, if they were to go somewhere else, it would ruin their opportunity to do this mitzvah? In other words, they're here for a purpose of this mitzvah. If they jeopardize their ability to fulfill this mitzvah, then then their whole purpose of their travel was in vain. In other words, they wouldn't be obligated if it's going to jeopardize their shluchei mitzvah purpose. But what about if it's not going to jeopardize that purpose? They're going to be able to do both. Here, Tosfos mentions in the Tosfos shluchei mitzvah nan, he says it would end up that they're going to lose their ability to do this mitzvah, whatever they came for, if they go look around for another sukkah, they're not gonna be able to do what they need. So it sounded like maybe they had to come very late, and because they came very late, they only had this opportunity to maybe go to this Reish Galusa's sukkah. They wouldn't have been able, if they went and looked around for another sukkah, they wouldn't have done their job, which they did, maybe something along those lines.
You couldn't come and not say hello. You have to first go to the guy in charge to say hello. Okay, and once you're there, they say, "You want you to sleep here?" You say.
Okay. So that's the way Tosfos over here brings that this was that this is the situation that they wouldn't have been able to fulfill their shlichus. We will see later on in the Gemara where it talks about this concept of shluchei mitzvah that Rashi seems to hold that even if they could go to another sukkah, they don't have to. They have like a blanket exemption, and they're not obligated to look for another sukkah. So we're shluchei mitzvah. We shouldn't be involved in even thinking about another sukkah because we're shluchei mitzvah. Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, well, in this story, the Reish Galusa has a worthy administrator, but aren't there stories in other parts of the Gemara where employees of the Reish Galusa act like goons?
Yeah, I can't think of one, but yeah, not always was the Reish Galusa it was more of a political leader rather than a rabbinic leader. So so it seems that there must have been stories. I can't recall any, but there must have been stories. I'm sure if you look it up on Google, you'll find the different names of all the exilarchs. Maybe in that Art Scroll book might have Reish Galusa, might have a list of the Reish Galusas. Okay. Anyway, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So now we come to the next Gemara. We are on page 10b, and we are holding. The last word on the line is Amar, and must be about 15 lines from the top. Let's see, 5, 10, maybe 15, maybe about 17 lines from the top. Amar, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Shmuel. Mutar lishon bekila. You're allowed to sleep on a bed that has a kila. Now, kila sounds very similar to what we had, a canopy, kinoifus hamita. It sounds very similar. There was basically there's a sheet on top of poles, but we'll soon see in the Gemara that kila there is a difference between kila and kinoifus. We'll soon see one of them is more permanent. In other words, it's meant to have these sheets covering it, and the other one, it seems that maybe they put the sheets over these poles, but not necessarily was it meant to be there on a permanent basis. So on a special occasion, you put the sheet over it, this covering over it. But anyway, so this kila is this canopy. You have a canopy, and you're allowed to sleep the kila inside this kila. In other words, on the bed that has this canopy above it. Inside a sukkah, even though it has a roof. But there is a qualification that roof can't be 10 handbreadths higher than the bed. Well, it has to be within 10 handbreadths of the bed. because if it's less than 10 handbreadths, that's okay. That's it's not like an oil. And as we saw with the opinion earlier about that 10 hand that sukkah is 10 handbreadths. So anyway, if you're inside this type of canopy, as long as it's less than 10 handbreadths from the bed, it would not be a problem.
Rabbi,
Yes.
it says over here that the kila is like a netting.
Netting. Okay. You could, however it is, it's some type of a sheet. Okay. And again, I don't think any of us have this type of thing. Some type of sheet I don't know. Any of you sleep with a sheet above your bed, but in the olden days, this seemed to be more of a popular thing, I guess. So
This is what I mentioned last time, that a netting could be like a mosquito netting.
okay, which is fine. I'm not. Yeah, it sounds like right. Sounds like possibly that's the purpose of it. Let's see what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, said that it's okay. You're not considered to be dwelling in a separate entity, but rather you're inside your sukkah. It's kosher. Tashema, the Gemara says, come in here. Let's see if we have a question on what Shmuel said from a brisa. Hayoshein bekila besukkah lo yotze dechavasi. There is a brisa that says person who sleeps inside the tequila in a sukkah is not fulfilling his obligation. And it sounds like it's a contradiction on what Shmuel said. So Shmuel tried to say halacha that it's okay. And here we have a brisa from a Tana. Brisa means it's from one of the Tanoim who says that it's not valid. It's not a kosher sukkah. You didn't fulfill your obligation. So the Gemara answers, the Gemara says, very easy answer. We qualified what Shmuel said, that it has to be less than 10 handbreadths. So the brisa doesn't say clearly how big it is. So we will say that it means that it's bigger than 10 handbreadths, and that's why it's a problem. The Gemara says, Meisvei, the Bnei Yeshiva asked a question on Shmuel from a Mishnah. Hayoshin tachas hamita, person who sleeps under a bed, the sukkah, inside the sukkah, lo yatze dechavasi, did not fulfill his obligation. And the situation of such a scenario where you're sleeping under a bed, it probably is less than 10 handbreadths. And if it's less than 10 handbreadths, Shmuel seemed to say that's not a problem. And here the Mishnah says that it is a problem. So the Gemara says, didn't Shmuel explain the Mishnah to be that it's a very tall bed, that it actually has 10 handbreadths of space below it? And therefore, if you sleep in that 10 handbreadths of space, then you are sleeping in a separate structure, not considered inside the sukkah. So the Gemara says, okay, I guess we'll have to explain it that way. But what about this following, the next Mishnah that we bring, which is really a Mishnah we learned already. Tashema, come in here, we have a Mishnah that we just learned, Oisha Piris al Gabe Kinaifas, that if you spread out this sheet above the Kinaifas, the canopy, you spread the sheet on top of these poles and made a canopy on your bed, Psula, it is invalid. Your sukkah, and you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of sleeping in your sukkah by sleeping on this bed, because it's like a separate entity. It has kinaifas. And the kinaifas, we said, is considered an oil. It's a tent. It's 4 of them. There's 4 poles. So the Gemara says, Hasam Nami, Digvi Yasara. Over there also, it's talking about that these kinaifas are 10 handbreadths above from the bed. Because they're 10 handbreadths above from the bed, you are not allowed to sleep in it. But if it was less than 10 handbreadths, then it wouldn't be a problem, as Shmuel said. So the Gemara says you can't say that it's talking about that it's more than 10 handbreadths, or 10 handbreadths or more. But we didn't learn that way because there's a brisa that explains the Tanya, because we learned in a brisa naklitin shnayim, when it talks about the naklite hamita, the two poles of the bed, that you have a sheet that hangs drapes over them, and it's more like a triangle shape. Excuse me. So that which was permissible, that is shnayim. That is that there's two poles, one at the head, one at the feet, and there's a beam that goes in between the two, or a pole that goes in between these, that attaches these two poles. There's two vertical poles and one horizontal pole attaching the two on the top, and then you drape over them a sheet, and it somehow spreads like a triangle, and that was considered okay. And it says in the brisa, kinaifais arba. Kinaifais means that there's four poles, and that makes it like a tent. And pires al gabi kinaifais, if you have spread out a sheet on top of the canopy, on top of these four poles, so then psula, it's considered invalid. The sukkah is not valid to dwell in, to sleep in. Agabi naklitin, but if you spread it over the naklitin, kshera, it would be kosher. And the brisa spells out then that only applies if it's not 10 handbreadths above from the bed, because if it's 10 handbreadths above from the bed, that would actually be considered an invalid. It would be considered invalid. So we see that that when it talks about the kinaifais are also talking about the same case, that they're less than 10 handbreadths, and still it's considered invalid to sleep inside this bed, because they're comparing the two cases. In one of the cases we said is obviously not talking about 10 handbreadths above the bed. So the other one, which we're contrasting it to, is a different type of structure, because it has four poles, but the rules about it are obviously the same, because we're contrasting the two. So Mechlal, the kinaifais, avalpi she'ena gavayin asara, the kinaifais, even though it doesn't have 10 handbreadths, it's also going to be invalid. And how could Shmuel say that the kila is okay to sleep in? And the hayoshin bekila, that Shmuel said, mutter lishan bekila, that you're allowed to sleep in a kila. And how could that? Why that kila is less than 10 handbreadths? The kinaifais is basically the same thing. So the Gemara answers, shane kinaifais dikviyi. Kinaifais are more permanent, and they're attached to these legs of the bed much more permanently. It's considered more of a tent, even if it's less than 10 handbreadths. But the kila is not so attached so firmly. It's not considered a oyel tent if it doesn't have 10 handbreadths. So this is the difference between kila and kinaifis. Again, it's a little hard to understand. Maybe like what exactly, because of we don't have these. At least I'm not familiar with people sleeping in these type of things where you have a canopy above the bed, or one is more temporary, one is more permanent. But anyway, that's it seems that in those days maybe they had something called a kila that was less permanent, it was temporary, and maybe like David was saying, that it's more of a screen rather than an actual decorative sheet. I don't know how to translate it. Yes, David.
There's a picture here. I don't know if you have a picture where you are in Art Schools, or you want me to share this picture.
I don't have the Art School, so I don't know if the Art School has.
So can I share this picture?
Okay, sure. We have 3 minutes left, so if you could do it real fast.
You see that?
Yeah. So they're learning both of them. See, I mean, the way they're showing them sounds like both of them are pretty much screens more than an actual sheet. At least they, that's how they look, very see-through.
Well, they're translating kila as a net.
As a net.
Netting.
No, not kila. These are not kilas. These are naklitin and kinaifas. All of them they're translating as nets.
No, I mean, but the material that's over it is almost like a
net. But
netting.
Now when you explained it earlier, I thought you were saying that they're translating kila as a net and kinaifas and naklitin as more sheets. But it turns out that it looks like they're doing all of them. They're considering them like nets.
Yeah,
so
unless they're just doing this transparent, so you can get an idea of what they're talking about.
Right, which could be, yeah. In any event, I don't sleep with one of these nets or sheets on top, so I'm not exactly familiar with this custom. But if a person wanted to sleep that way in the sukkah, there could be a problem if it's at least from our Gemara, it seems that there's a problem if it's called kinaifais, but if it's kila, then it's not a problem. The difference the Gemara says is one is more kviyi. The kinaifais is kviyi; they're more attached, more permanent, and therefore it's more like a tent. Even though it's less than 10 handbreadths, it would be a problem. But if it was a kila, it's not a problem. It's less than 10 handbreadths. There is discussion about the naklitin. Why, if it's less than 10 handbreadths, is naklitin a problem? It's naklitin doesn't have an oil on the top. It's not a real oil, because the naklitin case was two poles. You have two vertical poles, one horizontal pole attaching the two, and then you put the sheet hanging along on top of that beam. And it basically makes a triangle, but there's no tefach, handbreadth of space flat on top. So it's really not an oil. According to the laws of oil, you don't have an oil, as our Mishnah spelled out. But the Brisa seems to say that it could still be a problem if it's 10 handbreadths tall. Only if it's less than 10 handbreadths. What did it say? That well, naklitin was I'm sorry, yeah, naklitin is not a problem. Kshera, it's kosher as long as it's not 10 handbreadths. But what does 10 handbreadths do? 10 handbreadths shouldn't ruin anything. It doesn't have an oil. Doesn't have that teva. So Taisvis wants to explain that it's basically a derabanan. It's a rabbinic law that's going to that the rabbis prohibited naklitin if it was more than 10 handbreadths. But really, biblically, it's not an oihel, and it would be a kosher sukkah. So that would explain the naklitin law of the Brisa, which seemed surprising that if it was more than 10 handbreadths, that would be a problem. There's no tent over there. It's not a tent at all. It doesn't have a tefach. It has to have the flat tefach, a handbreadth of flatness to make it called the real oil. So that would be at least one of the explanations. Okay, we're going to stop here. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.